The concept of fate as an external force, driving events which have been predetermined and are, therefore, outside of an individual person's control, is central to Shakespeare's plotting of Romeo and Juliet. Just as surely as Romeo and Juliet are destined to meet and fall in love, they are destined to part this life to be reunited in the next, dying so that Verona, which has stagnated and festered under the curse of the blood feud pursued by the Capulets and the Montagues over many years, can finally be reborn. As a 21st century audience, we are likely to be extremely sceptical of the notion of our lives being mapped out from the moment we are born to the moment we die, our ability to make choices of our own free will just an illusion. If good or bad things happen to us, we generally put them down to a combination of our actions, the actions of others, and random circumstances or coincidences. The only meaning that there is to life is the one we, as humans, retrospectively place on it. What we mustn't forget, however, is that the play is not real life, but is a construct. It is a product of the beliefs of the time, which are very different from those of today. In 1597, the year Shakespeare wrote the play, belief that our life course was mapped out in the stars, written in a language that could be read and interpreted by scholars, was widespread. He clearly states in the prologue that fate orchestrates the tragedy. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. The pair are born to die. Not only do they take their life from the loins of the two foes, i.e. they are born, but they also take their life, i.e. they commit suicide. Shakespeare's use of a double meaning here highlights the way in which their births and deaths are inextricably linked. They are also star-crossed. It has already been written in the stars that they are ill-fated and that their love is death-marked, or doomed to death. So arguing whether the servant meeting Romeo on the day of the feast and asking him to read the invitation list is down to fate or coincidence is pointless. This and other events in the play are not intended as coincidences, but as fate. Shakespeare doesn't frame them as coincidences, so we shouldn't either. The Elizabethan era coincided with what has become known as the period of the Renaissance. The word Renaissance is French for rebirth, and refers to a time of a flowering of knowledge, music, literature, art and philosophy. It was also at this time that modern science was born. Copernicus had published his heliocentric model in 1543, placing the sun at the centre of the universe, and the first telescope was to appear in 1608. It is of no surprise that scientific observation of the heavens was of such interest. The rhythms and routines of daily life were dependent upon the skies, as there was no electricity and no artificial light to extend working hours beyond sundown. This, of course, also meant that there was no light pollution, and so the stars were a much more salient feature of our lives then than they are today. The worldview at the time was a traditional one, in that the spiritual realm exists and takes precedence over the material one. Astronomy, the objective science of the laws regulating celestial bodies, has its roots in astrology, now considered a pseudoscience, which is the belief that events on Earth are influenced by the stars. And there was less of a distinction between astronomy and astrology then than there is now. Astrology during the Renaissance era was used to attempt to predict all aspects of life, from natal astrology, which predicted what would happen to an individual based on their nativity, or the map of the sky at the moment of birth. Medical astrology, which identified weakness and illness in an individual and prescribed cures. Electional astrology, which was used to divine the optimum time for ceremonies and rituals. And mundane astrology, which was used to predict events on a national level, as well as the weather. Elizabeth I was known to believe in horoscopes, consulting the renowned astrologer John Dee about an auspicious date for her own coronation. Shakespeare's own interest in science has been clearly established, and this had an impact on how his beliefs in subjects such as astrology and fate evolved, and can be traced through his plays. In the very first speech of Henry VI Part 1, one of Shakespeare's earliest plays, written some 5 years before Romeo and Juliet, he reveals a traditional view where the appearance of comets are omens and the alignment of the stars has led to the death of the king. Comets, importing change of times and states, brandish your crystal tresses in the sky, and with them scourge the bad revolting stars that have consented unto Henry's death. Julius Caesar was written only 2 years after Romeo and Juliet, but we can see that he is already distancing his character's actions from the orchestrations of fate, and is instead placing them firmly within themselves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. The conflict in Shakespearean plays usually arises from the active plotting of one or more villains against the central character or characters. In tragedies, this scheming, e.g. by the witches in Macbeth and Iago in Othello, combined with the tragic hero's hamartia, or fatal flaw, e.g. ambition in the former and jealousy in the latter, leads to their downfall and death. In comedies, the dastardly plot, such as that by Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, is discovered before it is successful, and tragedy is averted. The difference with Romeo and Juliet, which is usually categorised as a love tragedy, is that there is no one actively scheming against them. The human villains of the play, e.g. Tybalt and Capulet, are not plotting against Romeo and Juliet per se, and their acts have unintended fateful consequences. Tybalt's villainous act to challenge Romeo to a duel is the catalyst for the tragedy, but it isn't a plot. It is rather the impulsive act of a hot-headed, aggressive young man who hates all Montagues, and Romeo is the latest Montague to have crossed him, albeit inadvertently. Capulet's advancement of the wedding, which is transformed into a villainous act by his aggressive treatment and verbal abuse of his daughter, is not a plot intended to harm her. Rather than an act of malicious subterfuge, it is a blatantly self-serving attempt to consolidate his own political power and wealth. The real villain of the play seems to be fate itself, as the tragedy is driven by forces outside of the couple's control, as they desperately attempt to subvert them. Shakespeare seems to frame the story as a battle between fate and free will, as every time Romeo and Juliet take a course of action designed to allow them to be together, something happens outside of their control to thwart them. Indeed, when referring to fate, the characters tend to personify it, giving it human personality traits and intentions. But even the choice underpinning these actions is illusory. None of Romeo and Juliet's choices are made freely. They don't choose to fall in love. It is literally love at first sight. Subsequently, the couple aren't so much faced with choices as with alternatives that they have to confront because of either the actions of others or circumstances beyond their control. They don't choose to get married so quickly. They have to, because the alternative is that Juliet will be betrothed to Paris. Romeo doesn't choose to kill Tybalt. He is honour bound to, the alternative being a dishonour which he cannot countenance. Juliet doesn't choose to take the potion and feign death. The alternative is that she will be forced to commit bigamy, a mortal sin in the eyes of God, which is anathema to her. Romeo and Juliet are aware of the machinations of fate that bring them together and force them apart. They both see omens throughout and explicitly refer to fate and how it seems to be always acting against them. Even before they meet, just before the Capulets' feast, When Benvolio complains that all this talking has made them too late for the festivities, Romeo laments, "I fear too early. My mind misgives some consequence yet, hanging in the stars, shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast, by some vile forfeit of untimely death. But he that hath the steerage of my course, direct my sail." He has a feeling that something bad is going to happen, something that has been ordained by the stars, but that is yet hanging, i.e., it is yet to be revealed, that will be initiated by going to the feast. He foresees his own untimely or premature death, but he ignores his gut instinct. At this point, he seems resigned to what fate has in store for him. Note the way in which he refers to a capitalised he here, alluding to God. His fate is in God's hands, even if he suspects it will end in tragedy. Likewise, on discovering Romeo's true identity, Juliet exclaims, "Prodigious birth of love it is to me that I must love a loathed enemy." The word prodigious here means ominous or foretelling of evil. Juliet senses that their love can only end in tragedy, and yet she feels compelled to pursue it. In Act 3, Scene 1, after the death of Mercutio at the hands of Tybalt, but through Romeo's fault, Romeo declares, "This day's black fate on mo days doth depend. This but begins the woe, others must end." He has tried to avoid fighting with Tybalt, but this has only led to Mercutio's death, which will not be the end of the matter, only the beginning. Here, Romeo is explicitly acknowledging that he is no longer in control of the day's events, the woe of which will go on to trigger more tragedy that will only end in mo days or at a later date. He knows what he has to do: kill Tybalt. Note the polyptoton of days, and their alliteration with doth depend, and the plosive alliteration of black and but begins. The heaviness of this sound patterning communicating how weighed down and powerless Romeo feels in the face of fate. When Tybalt returns, Romeo is compelled to avenge his friend's death and reassert the masculinity that he feels he has been robbed of by his love for Juliet. He realises, however, as soon as Tybalt is dead, that he is merely fortune's fool, or God's jester, being used and abused for entertainment, like a fool in a royal court. The word fool also means a person who is easily tricked into doing silly or stupid things. He realises that the actions he felt driven to take were for the benefit of a higher power, rather than himself. As Romeo descends from the balcony after his one night with Juliet, she, seeing him from above, exclaims, "O God, I have an ill-divining soul. Methinks I see thee now thou art so low, as one dead at the bottom of a tomb." This is an example of prolepsis, or foreshadowing, where something is represented as existing before it actually does. The very next time that Juliet is with Romeo, in Act 5, Scene 3, waking as the effects of the potion wear off, Romeo lying dead in the Capulet's tomb is exactly what she does see, and it is that which compels her to take her own life. Just a few lines after Romeo has gone, she addresses her words in an apostrophe to Fortune. "O Fortune, Fortune, all men call thee fickle. If thou art fickle, what dost thou with him that is renowned for faith? Be fickle, Fortune, for then I hope thou wilt not keep him long, but send him back." In this short speech, Juliet strives to regain control of herself after her disturbing vision. She attempts to make sense of what has happened to them by framing it as bad luck, which can just as quickly turn to good. She is powerless to change fate through her own actions, but acknowledges that fortune, or luck, is said to be fickle, or capricious, changing on a whim. If this is so, fortune has no use for Romeo because he is its antithesis, as he is renowned for faith, or is steadfast and loyal. Her command to fortune to indeed be fickle, because this means it won't keep him long before deciding on a whim to send him back to her, gives her an illusory sense of power, as she is commanding it to be what it will be anyway. Of course, sending Romeo back to her is exactly what fate does, but not in the manner in which she hopes. Juliet's powerlessness in the face of fate is highlighted once more at the end of Act 3, Scene 5, after she has learnt that her father, ignorant of the fact that she is already married, intends for her to marry Paris without delay. If Juliet does what her father expects of her, she will, in committing bigamy, also commit a mortal sin in the eyes of God. She pleads with the nurse. "O God, O nurse, how shall this be prevented? My husband is on earth, my faith in heaven. How shall that faith return again to earth, unless that husband send it me from heaven by leaving earth? Comfort me, counsel me." The impossible position that fate has put her in is enhanced by the convoluted logic and repetition of earth, faith, heaven and husband in this speech. Her husband is on earth, i.e. he is still alive, but her faith is in heaven, i.e. she has made a sacred marriage vow which is with God. She is only free to make that vow once more, to marry again, when that faith has returned again to earth, which can only happen when her husband sends it her from heaven, i.e. when he is dead. She acknowledges the malign role of fate in her plight. Alack, that heaven should practise stratagems upon so soft a subject as myself. She laments that fate should practise stratagems or cruel and dirty tricks on someone who is so soft, or as weak and undeserving as herself. In Act 5, Scene 1, Romeo is in exile in Mantua when he receives news from Balthazar that Juliet is dead and interred in the Capulets' family tomb. Fate has intervened once more. This time Friar John, the brother to whom Friar Lawrence entrusted the delivery to Romeo of the letter containing the plan, has been kept back in Verona, suspected of being in a house infected with plague. For Romeo, ignorant of the scheme, this is the last straw, as he exclaims in a moment of hubris. "Esteem so? Then I defy you, stars." No longer willing to be fortune's fool, he decides to take matters into his own hands and returns to Verona to die by Juliet's side, not of course realising that he is playing into the very hands of fate by doing so. On his arrival, as he looks down at Juliet, as fate would have it, just before she wakes up, he mistakes the signs of life in her face for the delay in the signs of death, declaring, "Oh, here will I set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh." A yoke is a wooden frame which fits over the shoulders of either a person or an animal, which allows them to either carry a load or pull a plough. It is a symbol of burden and subordination. He believes that by committing suicide he will shake off the dominion of the inauspicious or unfavourable stars, although of course the audience knows that this is exactly what he is destined to do. Paradoxically, by exercising his free will to choose to die, he is succumbing to fate, which has decreed that it shall be so. The chorus in the prologue proclaims that the pair's love is death-marked, and indeed the way in which the language used by the characters is also permeated by images of death and calamity when linked to love, sex and marriage, demonstrates how fate has a presence which is felt even at a subconscious level. When Juliet sends the nurse to find out Romeo's identity in Act 1, Scene 5, she exclaims, "If he be married, my grave is like to be my wedding bed." What Juliet means here is that if she finds out that Romeo is already married to someone else, she will, because of this, be married to her grave, i.e. she will die unmarried. The irony of Juliet's words is that they are proleptic, i.e. they actually foreshadow the final scene. Romeo's marriage, not to someone else but to Juliet herself, shall be the cause of her death, or her grave and wedding bed being one and the same, as the pair, through their suicides, are united for eternity in the Capulet's tomb in Act 5, Scene 3. Lady Capulet also echoes this image the last time that she sees her daughter alive when, in anger at Juliet's defiance at the plan for her to marry Paris, she says to Lord Capulet, "Ay, sir, but she will none. She gives you thanks. I would the fool were married to her grave." If ever there were a case of be careful what you wish for, this is it. When Romeo and Juliet meet in secret, in the balcony scene of Act 2, Scene 2, Juliet's joy at the contract or binding vows of love that they have made is overcome by doubt. She laments that it is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning which doth cease to be ere one can say it lightens. Her simile is interesting here, as her intention is to allude to the transience of lightning. Not only is lightning short-lived, though, it is also potentially dangerous and destructive. Friar Lawrence also warns against the hastiness of their love, predicting that these violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. Combining the language of physical intimacy with an image of explosion and annihilation, he suggests that such an extreme passion can only end in disaster. Violence breeds violence, even if its origins are pleasure. Juliet's soliloquy at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 2, where she is impatiently awaiting the arrival of Romeo so that they can consummate their marriage, takes the form of an epithalamion, or wedding song, and should be filled with joy. But this is overshadowed by a sense of impending doom, as her choice of imagery unintentionally communicates calamity and death. She begins, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging. Such a waggoner as Phaeton would whip you to the west and bring cloudy night immediately." Not only does her choice of imagery communicate her impatience and impulsivity, but also the danger and tragedy that this love will bring. The fiery-footed steeds to whom she refers are the horses who drew the chariot of Phoebus Apollo, the sun god, across the sky, and so she is impatient that they should speed towards his lodging or his bed. Phaeton was Phoebus Apollo's son who took his father's chariot, but, failing to control the horses, threatened to set the earth on fire. They knocked him out of the chariot, and Zeus struck him dead with a thunderbolt before he hit the ground. The subtext of this is that hasty and uncontrolled actions have catastrophic ends. In conclusion, we can see that, in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare uses fate as the primary device to drive the plot forward. The audience knows from the very start that the play will end in tragedy, and so the interest is less on what is going to happen, but on how it's going to happen. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.